you don't always have a camera videoing a truck being held at gunpoint or where those train rail cars are being broken into. It's not something you always see on a video or some sort of surveillance, and it doesn't get as much attention. So it is something we do have to work on and make sure that more members know about, so we can get some more attention on this and we can push back.
Well, Congressman, let's start here. You've introduced a bill titled H.R. 8834. The actual name is the Safeguarding Our Supply Chains Act. Let's start with the basic reason you've introduced the bill. What is the overall problem that you're trying to address?
Well, the overall problem we're trying to address is supply chain fraud. And I mean, uh, stealing is or small time theft is not a huge issue. I mean, it is, but it's not as big of an issue as what we're dealing with right now. And it seems like it's getting to a point where you've got a lot of organized crime behind it, and that's something that we're trying to focus on with this piece of legislation.
Um, I want to talk a little bit about how your bill addresses the problem. And part of that is it would set up a supply chain crime coordination center. What would the function of that center be?
Well, one of the issues that we've dealt with in government a lot of times is sometimes you've got different agencies that aren't talking to one another and they get a little territorial. And so what we're doing here is we're asking Homeland Security to work in conjunction with the FBI, the U.S. And the U.S. Attorney General to establish this task force. And it's just so that they can communicate with one another, share notes, and make sure that they're working together to address this issue.
It would also set up a task force. And I'm kind of curious here, what would the role be of that task force, and how would it differ from what the coordination center would be doing?
Well, the task force, I think, would be the exact spot where they would do all the coordination and they would work together. And so there are dollars associated with this. So they would have the ability to hire folks and put them in a position and dedicate those people to this specific task of going after this type of theft.
In looking at the text of your bill, it was pretty specific in terms of who would be on that task force. Can you give people an idea of maybe just some examples of what type of people you foresee being on this task force?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be very specific on who the people are, but obviously we want the different departments to have folks in those agencies working together. And it's national organizations that work across state lines, making sure that they have the ability to access information wherever the theft may be within our country.
Now, I want to ask a devil's advocate question here before we go further. This is already a crime, obviously, and there are people in law enforcement already pursuing criminals who operate in this area, primarily at the state and local level. With that in mind, why is there a need for a task force or a coordination center at the federal level if this is being handled locally?
Oh, and that's a great question. And that's something that I'll give you an example of something that happened in my district a number of years ago. We had an issue with a large crime organization here working in the Central Valley, and the local law enforcement was dealing with it, but the local law enforcement didn't have the resources at their fingertips to be able to deal with the size of the crime organization they were dealing with. And this is the same type of thing. You've got your local law enforcement, and especially in California, who are already struggling to keep up with the number of crimes that they're dealing with. Now you throw in a nationwide or a large criminal organization who is very well organized. And so it could be a lot for a local law enforcement agency to deal with. And so we're throwing in more weight behind them. And obviously the Homeland Security, FBI, Attorney General, they have more attorneys at their disposal. They have more tools at their disposal. They've got a lot of things that they have the ability to access and use to help assist my local law enforcement in dealing with these types of things. And obviously, if you're a local law enforcement agency, you might not see a connection between something in Central Valley, California, being connected with something in Arkansas, for example. But you want to make sure that we have somewhere where those connections could be made and we could associate those crimes together and prosecute those to the full extent of the existing laws.
You mentioned California a couple of times there, and certainly our listeners are familiar with the fact that that is a hot spot for this type of crime, not only in trucking, which is the main interest we have, but I've seen some pictures and video of what's happened with some trains carrying cargo containers. Um, with that in mind, what are some of the other hotspots across the nation that came to your attention as you were looking into how to create a bill to address the subject?
Well, for me, California is obviously the first and foremost is the one I heard about the most. And this actually, I started hearing about some of these crimes even before I was in elected office. I started hearing about things where you had people creating fake manifests and fake documentation, and trucks would literally roll into some of my processing plants and grab a truckload of pistachios or a truckload of almonds. And those are pretty high value commodities. And they would drive off with literally 25 tons of this product. And this wasn't just some random guy coming up with a piece of paper and a truck. I mean, this is an organized situation. But I assume any location across the country that has a major hub, a major transportation, if it's a port or if it's a some sort of trucking hub, they're all going to have this type of situation.
I want to talk about the downstream effects for a moment here. Obviously, the effect on the trucking industry is obvious, but this also has an effect on general consumers. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, obviously, anytime anything is being stolen from either a trucking company or someone who makes the product or transports the product or delivers the product, it's going to have a cost on consumers. And so anytime that we have the ability to prevent as much theft as possible at any level, it's going to help lower the price to consumers. And so this is obviously something that I try to pay as much attention to as possible. I mean, we all see the videos online of people walking into grocery stores, into pharmacies, and into department stores or Apple stores and literally just grabbing things and walking out. We all know that at the end of the day, the consumer is going to pay for those things and something has to be done. And so this bill is very specific to our supply chain because that is right behind the stores. And we all know the importance of trucking. We all know the importance of rail and the ability for them to be able to deliver those products. But the consumer, sadly, ultimately always pays for everything, especially on this front. This one adds a lot of cost to the storefront, and storefronts are added to the price tag.
I noticed you have some co-sponsors on the bill already, and I know we're still early in the process, but what has the reaction been from your fellow lawmakers to the bill?
Members have signed on, and anytime you bring this up, they sign on pretty quickly. This is a very non-controversial piece of legislation. It's very bipartisan. Both my neighbors here in California signed on. Jim Costa, who's a Democrat, Vince Fong, who's a Republican. But then I've got people from Illinois, people from Texas, and other parts of the country signing on. And the more they hear about it, obviously they sign on because it is a very simple bill. It's something that most people are seeing in their districts, and they want to make sure that they're part of the solution on this one.
Does it seem to you that your fellow members of Congress, and not only the people who have co-sponsored, but also other members, does it seem like they're generally aware of the situation involving cargo theft?
I don't know if they're as aware. I think most people notice the stuff that they see on TV. And I have friends in Washington who have literally been inside of like a CS, for example, while it was being robbed. You have members of Congress who have actually been robbed, either one at gunpoint outside of his apartment. You had one that was followed into an elevator and she had to fight off an attacker. So people are very familiar with the type of theft and crime that is going on around the country. But this is one that I don't know many people notice because you don't always have a camera videoing a truck being held at gunpoint or where those train rail cars are being broken into. It's not something you always see on a video or some sort of surveillance, and it doesn't get as much attention. So it is something we do have to work on and make sure that more members know about, so we can get some more attention on this and we can push back.
How much money would your bill set aside to help combat cargo theft?
Well, we did two things. We put $2 million in the appropriations bill for fiscal year 2025, but ultimately and there are two different things here. We did one where we put this in an appropriations bill with $2 million, but then we have the authorizing bill, which is the bill we're talking about, where we authorize expenditures of $100 million from 2025 through 2029. So for a total of 5 years.
Um, and I know that you've got the task force and the coordination center in there, but can you be a little bit more specific in terms of how you foresee that money being spent if you get the bill passed?
The money will be spent mostly in hiring people and dedicating those people specific to this task. That's the goal, is to have people dedicated to this specific task of going after this specific crime. We need people dedicated to make sure that this is what they're focused on all the time, 24/7. Just like the people that watch your show or listen to your show, they're 24 hours on the road moving products, making sure that us as consumers have things at the store to purchase, to feed our families, to clothe our families. And we need law enforcement in the same position 24 hours a day, watching and helping and looking for this type of crime.
Okay. Well, Congressman, that's all I have. Is there anything else about this issue that you think people need to know, or maybe something that I didn't ask about that you think I should have?
Well, the only thing I would ask is that folks, if they have the opportunity who are listening, obviously call their member of Congress, bring this bill to their attention, and ask their representative to at least take a look at it and hopefully sign on to it so we can get this thing signed into law.
Excellent. Congressman, thank you very much for your time.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.